Scusate, posso dirvi una cosa?
Sì.
Non vedo... Ah sì, adesso vedo la condivisione, prima non c'era. Ok, niente.
Bene.
Okay, we are online.
Yeah, we are online also on YouTube.
Okay, you can see the screen, I suppose, and let me know where to start.
Giacomo, però la vediamo a schermo non la vediamo a schermo intero, vediamo il Finder sopra.
Sì, è per la prima slide. Vabbè, ok, risolvo. Ok.
Vabbè, a posto.
Ok. Se volete possiamo partire?
Sì.
Okay, good morning and welcome to the second session of the City as a Renewable Resource Masterclass. My name is Giacomo Magnabosco and I'm here today with my colleagues Alessia Franzese, Andrea Fantin and Luca Nicoletto. The masterclass is part of the Iuav PhD in Urbanism School activities, which is coordinated by Professor Maria Chiaratosi, together with Professor Paola Viganò, Stefano Munarin, Lorenzo Fabian, and Viviane Ferrario from Iuav. And from other university, we have Professor Federico Zanfi from Politecnico di Milano, and Professor Enrico Formato from University of Federico II di Napoli, that completes the scientific board. Let us say thank you to all of you to critically support us during the organization of the masterclass. Indeed, I see the floor to Maria Chiaratosi, our professor, for institutional greetings. The online stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank all our colleagues, the invited speakers, to be here today with us and share this very important masterclass. First of all, I want to thank Luca, Andrea, Alessia, and Giacomo for their effort in organizing this masterclass. I think we are at the second session of the masterclass, and also yesterday it has been very interesting. A lot of important issues has been raised up, and the discussion has been, of course, very well followed by a lot of people, and I hope it will be the same today. So thank you for your effort and for having invited so very important speakers. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and back to the masterclass. I'm going to share the screen again, and we'll start our presentation. Okay, we're online. Perfect. All of this led us to today's session. So first of all, we would like to warmly welcome our guests, Professor Paola Viganò, Professor Gunther Vogt, Aristide Athanasiadis, Margherita Manfra, and Thomas Stelmach. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. We are very excited to listen to you all. Furthermore, we believe that sharing our expertise will enhance the discussion around crucial topics among our PhD exploration. We would like to spend a couple of words about the first session. Yesterday, we went through the definition of resource, capitalizing and discussing the validity of the hypothesis, the city as a renewable resource. Specifically, we have resumed the whole session in few words, which delineates this concept. How to change evaluation parameters in order to define the concept of value. The centrality of the body, the role of the body as a link between space, appropriation, and people. The duality of time through both a long and short time frame. And lastly, understanding the political meaning of ecological transition and the city intersection within human being, nature, and artifacts. Back to the masterclass. Again, let's start to introduce ourselves properly. It's important for us not to lose sight of the big picture of our research. In fact, we are spending a few words on our personal PhD researches necessary to frame our aims. So please, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giacomo, and good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Fantin, a PhD student at Iuav University. And the research that I've been working on sheds light on the definition of a new survey project, overcoming monodisciplinary approaches where society, space, and the corresponding spatial organizations cannot be read in unison. Looking back at the legacy left to us by intellectuals such as Sir Thomas Henry Huxley, Sir Patrick Geddes, the research through an evolutionary framework defines the genesis of an idea, the history of an idea, the value section. Consequently, assuming the historical dichotomic relationship between the dividing water, which defines governmental speciality, and the river basin, understood as the fundamental physiographic unit, the research explores how the value section can be defined as a model for the description and reading of today's Italian territory. As a matter of fact, in a context of changing geography, environmental, social, and economic transition, the rereading process of the value section aims to be a veritable tool for planning and designing with the innate critical power, which has been largely lacking so far. Please, Alessia, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. I am Alessia Franzese, and my PhD research deals with the transition from the collective city to the cooperative city. My research investigated the relations between the collective equipment inherited from a normative Italian device and the practices of care that reactivate those spaces. The case study is in the eastern periphery of Naples, south of Italy. We generically use to define this kind of space, such as public space, but we can draw complex geography about actors, laws, fundings, and practices which generate conflicts toward its valorization. The exploration focuses on some issues used as lens. The constitutional rights that spaces and practices ensure or deny, the collective realm, which make it possible to move from the abstraction of rights to the materiality of needs, as Stefano Rodotà argued, and the property issue, how collective uses allow to overcome the public-private opposition towards commons as a non-proprietary dimension. The scenario, an exploration tool for the future, is about the emancipation of civic and collective uses, that is a specific regulatory device used in Naples to recognize the emerging commons management. It can become a device for urban project revisioning in the paradigm of urban regeneration. Please, Giacomo.
Hello, thank you, Alessia. I'm Giacomo again, and my doctoral research focuses on the topic of adaptation, specifically adaptation of the city territory to climate change. To do so, the thesis look at the city territory of Central Veneto, waters infrastructure palimpsest, as a paradigmatic case to observe the projecting capabilities of the metaphor of adaptation in terms of spatial transformation, to observe and compare the different dimensions, political, economical, and social, and the scales from local, national, European, and global that the term adaptation moves and solicitates. And to weight the relapses of the adaptation project from an ecological point of view in the territory of Veneto region. Lastly, to describe the landscape role and transformation needed to cope with the climate crisis. To do so, specifically, the thesis uses different observation tools to investigate the different levels that the theme of adaptation calls for, from site tracking from the biological science to the processes of the city, to the spatial landscape narratives, ending with an hermeneutical comparison between plans, political agendas, and projects that have been able to put at the center of their means the ecological transition. And now, Luca Nicoletto will introduce himself. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Giacomo, and good morning, everyone. My PhD research looks at urban regeneration processes in the current paradigm shift where the city does not expand but rewrites itself. My first hypothesis is about the possibility of an emerging theory on rewriting, a theory which is conceived as a scaffold, as a reference useful for practice based on knowledge nourished both by other theories and by the many experiences we are collecting nowadays. That's why I'm exploring two paths. The first is about the research of the roots of the term regeneration in disciplines dealing with cities and territory and reconstructing genealogies on thoughts on rewriting, such as Manfredo Tafuri Renovatio Urbis, or during the 80s, the urban theory on modification on Casabella Editoriali, for example, but also some more recent reflections on recycling and reusing the city. But at the same time, I'm observing the present experiences we are collecting. Let's say, what are we talking about when we talk about urban regeneration nowadays? I'm looking at some specific case studies in the Veneto region, and through operation of disassembling and deconstruction of these experiences, mostly publicly driven, such as the neighborhood contracts and urban scale projects of the National Plan for Suburbs, the aim is to look at the mechanism by which the city is interpreted once again as a palimpsest, how it has been modified and produced, leveraging on the stock of matter and embodied energy and on human capital. Even in the diversity and specificity of themes and territories we observe in our research investigation, our reflections converge on a basic hypothesis: the city as a resource, an instance that crosses our paths in different but always relevant ways. After a long period in which the paradigm of growth and expansion dominated the spatial design, we are facing a transition towards a cycle in which the city territory is going to rewrite itself. These issues has already been extensively explored in previous research. For instance, the national research Recycle Italy is one of them. By assuming existing space as a limited resource, we would like to discuss the need for a not new but still radical reinterpretation of the space as a palimpsest of traces, flows and changes, by exploring new descriptive forms and projective intentions for future visions. Last but not least, the masterclass investigates the role of urban space as a resource that urbanism deals in a critical relationship nowadays. Getting inside the point, the hypothesis we propose to discuss reassesses the special term that Soja argued in 2010 and remarks the central role of the space in contemporary society through an examination of the space as the resource. Space as a limited resource has also a renewal potential in itself that is usually neglected by policies and practices that shift the focus of the territorial transformation phenomena to social and technocratic aspects. As a consequence, the hypothesis needs to assume a more current and extended meaning of the word urban in the first place. Referencing a wide range of literature, from Brenner to Emin and Thrift to Harvey, in the direction of an urban theory without an outside. If the footprints of the city are everywhere, and if cities are only one of the forms of urbanization, they must be read as places that evolve dynamically, as arenas of broader socio-ecological processes. Using the Paola Viganò words, the city territory, the contemporary form of the city, is not to be considered just a problem, but a resource. Unfortunately, the reality keeps telling us another story where the city has been continuously interpreted as a problem. In a metabolic way, paraphrasing the words of Sabine Barr, the city is described as a parasite body, a consumer and dissipator of natural resources, an anti-ecological infrastructure where the city is still perceived as a source of pollution, ecologically speaking. And last but not least, within a regenerative frame, the city is linked to obsolete and rigid regulatory systems that block its innate transformation, leading to a consequently state of decay of the built environment, which turns the urban object into a mere management cost. So insisting on the hypothesis that the city territory is a resource, hence the physical space in both organic and mineral aspects has to be considered a capital that is embodied in the gray energy it contains, specifically the built heritage inherited from the paradigm of expansion, often underused and disused, a capital in the role of support for everyday social practices, in cooperation networks capable of enhancing the physical capital. A capital in the precarious but fundamental dynamic relationships that binds ecological infrastructure to climate phenomena. And ultimately, a resource is also the set of skills and investigative tools capable of interpreting the resource and flows that pass through the city. Indeed, there is a widespread awareness that the modernistic paradigm requires a new direction due to unsustainable and unfeasible models such as growth, expansion, and consumption. The environmental, energetic, and socio-economic transition leads to consider the potential of a different paradigm based on processes of rewriting the existing cities that look at the built space as a renewable resource. In this paradigm shift, we would like to explore the different implications of the use of this concept in physical spatial dimension and looking specifically at the issues and conflicts that arise. The urban project as an interpretative and projective device needs to be reoriented to challenge the contemporary issues. We propose three key concepts: complex and interscalar. Socio-technical approaches tend to oversimplify the physical dimension despite an increasing complexity of society. Hence, repetitive application of models focusing only on homogeneous standard solutions drive the design process. Meanwhile, different and local specificities are often omitted. As a consequence, the design process collides with interscalar dynamics based on construction of specific and contextual relationships. Therefore, within the paradigm of rewriting, the project needs to claim its role as a knowledge and project tool through both a descriptive depth and adherence to the complexity of phenomena. Open and flexible, within the complexity of the tabula scripta framework, the project deals with an unceasing stratification process and with the agency of different rationalities. The project needs to involve and integrate multiple requests and responsibilities in order to achieve the idea of the so-called open city. Furthermore, a flexible and incremental project over time with resilient attitudes is requested. As a result, the project is an interpretative device for the present that must explore potential futures rather than strengthen predetermined forms. A balancing process. The ecological fragilities of the planet, as well as socio-economic vulnerabilities, result to be heavily connected due to a transitional phenomena, made even more explicit by the COVID-19 pandemic and also climate change consequences that the city territory is facing nowadays. For this reason, the project for the city territory has to face forms of inequality of resource redistribution, access and use, in order to find a new dynamic ecological balance between human and non-human communities. In conclusion, assuming the hypothesis of the city as a renewable resource and also considering the limits and conflicts that this assumption generates, we identify three main keywords: resource, project, and space, that sum up our intents as well as organize the masterclass sessions. Each session is introduced by a question. Is the city a renewable resource? Is the space still relevant? How will the urban project change? In this session project, we start the discussion with the following question. How will the urban project change?
Thank you, Luca. As already mentioned at the beginning, we are very pleased to welcome the lecture of Professor Paola Viganò, architect and urbanist, professor in urban theory and urban design at the EPFL Lausanne, at the University of Venice. Then the lecturer, Professor Gunther Vogt, landscape architect and professor of landscape architecture at ETH of Zurich. In the role of discussant, today is joining us Margherita Manfra, architect member of the Orizzontale Collective based in Rome, which she works on experimental project between architecture, urbanism, public art and self-construction. And Aristina Tarasiadis, senior researcher at EPFL Lausanne, former chair of circular economy and urban metabolism at Université Libre de Bruxelles and co-founder of Metabolism of City Global Network. And at the end, Thomas Telmacht. Thomas is the founder and director of TSPA in Berlin and planning expert for Unabitat. Thank you for being virtually here today. A couple of information regarding the structure of today's session are as follows. So the session is divided in 3 sectors. The first one with the 2 lecturers, 45 minutes each. After that, it will follow 10 minutes for each discussant in order to critically collect reflection as well as question. And finally, a 20-minute open discussion where we'll be able to give voice also to the public. Well, I think everything is set up, and if Professor Paola Vigano is ready, we should start. So, Professor, the virtual stage is yours, and thank you. Professor, your microphone is out.
Good. It's good that we maintain a kind of ingenuity, you know, after almost 2 years on these tools. We are always starting from scratch. So I was thanking Luca, Andrea, Alessia, and Giacomo for not only for the invitation, but especially for organizing the masterclass. I think that Chiara Tosi was remembering yesterday that it was a long journey. And that the journey is important as much as the outcome. So, in the meantime, your work, your thesis, is almost concluded, and that's, I think, very interesting that you finally could make it. And I think you are different from the beginning. If I remember the first discussions, I think that it's really a pleasure to listen to your presentations. So. I suppose I have to share a screen. Let's see if this is working. Okay. Do you see a screen?
Yes.
Yes.
It's quite clear.
Yes. Good. So the question of the project, the way in which I'd like to go through it is by questioning, in fact, ourselves about this immense change, so what we call the transition, and questioning ourselves about our, if we are ready, let's say, if we are accommodating and changing, transforming our gaze, our tools, our system of values, and the way in which we conceive and we realize projects. This is a still from a very beautiful movie. It's Jonas that will be 25 in the year 2000. It's a movie from the 70s from Alain Tanner. And it was already in the 70s a kind of legendary or mythical movie, and I see it again today because you will find in this movie all the questions or the themes that we are now considering crucial. So about the evolution of work, about the evolution of values, and the fundamental change, the idea of transformation, of transition. That's, I think, is important because the transition is not unique. In your life, you go through several transitions, and this is just another one, is another moment. Maybe someone would say this is the most difficult one, but also in the 70s, the perception was that it was extremely hard and difficult transition. An old world was starting to be abandoned, the old industrial, let's say, revolution world, and the new economies were arriving. New ways of conceiving politics were imagined at that moment, and then we are now conceiving probably a new shift. The title of the masterclass, of course, imposes to me to look back to what I've been thinking and reflecting upon during at least, let's say, more than a decade, and with some of the problems that the PhD students have today. For example, the idea that how can we? What are the tools? What are the theories? Can you hear me?
Yes. Actually, right now, yes. Before was a kind of lack of voice for a couple of seconds. I don't know if you...
Oh, it's all good. It's good. Please continue.
Okay.
No, now
I think she's...
we lost the connection with Professor Paola Vigano.
We can't say the show must go on. Let's wait a little bit. The beauty of the live session. That's it.
Il bello della diretta.
Exactly.
Okay, the professor is connecting again. Okay.
I'm back.
Yes.
Welcome back. The microphone, Professor?
Yeah. So cosa sia successo. Ok, quindi ricondivido lo schermo.
Sì, grazie.
Allora. Can you see?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I'm very sorry, but this is just to remember that we are very fragile in any case. So I was speaking of the need I had to make a little bit the point of a series of concepts and words on which I've been working the last at least decade, and with the same effort. I think it was Luca especially insisting on that, the same effort to construct a frame, maybe a provisional frame, but nevertheless a theory in that sense about the city as a renewable resource. And I tried really as a kind of first way to enter this vast question to use life cycles, embodied energy, and inclusion as three main themes. For life cycles, of course, it's clear that we are working with concepts that are very dense and that each one of them contains specific metaphors of which we have to be fully aware. But in any case, the idea of recycling can invite you to conceive the city as a sequence of life cycle, question the project, starting from idea of the passage, the rhythm of opening and closures that are in the city. The second one, the embodied energy, was really not usual at the time. I mean, it was not usual to put it so fundamentally at the core of the transformation and of any discussion about sustainable transformations. And here it's clearly that the emphasis on metabolism is very important, but the stock is fundamental. And from economist Boulding, speaking and writing about how the stock is the fundamental issue for our well-being. And considering the relation between the energy crisis and the embodied energy that is already on site, and between urban stratification and the idea of recycling, because when you recycle, you have to understand this stratified condition. And the third theme, inclusion, is about the fact that when this type of big changes happen, then there is a redistribution of occasions, of potentials, of wealth. And so it's very important to be attentive and not blind to this kind of social modifications. Now I would like to use these three lenses, adding, let's say, a small step, because I conceive, I mean, the research is the good of the research is the research itself. No, it's not just the end. So we are continuously under revision of what we are doing, and in that sense, I think that, for example, the insistence on the embodied energy brought to the light, for me, the need of a new gaze, a gaze that is able to construct ideographies, so that is able to write the specific condition of each place, and a gaze in which you consider the material conditions in the territory. Let's say the kind of vision or exploratory research hypothesis was the idea of the 100% recycle that was meant to connect four goals: reducing the consumption, integrating renewable energy production, recycling energy, and valorizing the embodied energy. Here, the new point was to include valorizing embodied energy inside this series of possible policies. And then I'm talking of the beginning, let's say 10 years ago, more or almost 10 years ago. And then together at Iuav, together with colleagues, also Chiara Cavalieri, Cecilia Furlan, that were former PhD students, we went back on site in a survey campaign in order to try to understand what was changing at the moment. We were saying not so far from the economic crisis of 2008, 7 and 8. And then this is especially from Cecilia Furlan PhD thesis, this attention to what is in those buildings, and also the presence of a lot of underused space that is this kind of a blurring category that is so difficult to grasp, is not immediately modifying spatially the territory, but is nevertheless fundamental to understand economies, to understand the social practices, and in fact to detect the transformation that is ongoing. Together with the reflection at the moment on a strong adaptation also of mobility, very simply, we were touching at that moment on the main categories of CO2 emission, mobility, and the built structure. So I think that was in a way interesting. It was on the shoulder of previous research on the porosity of cities, so the Great Paris porous city. That was the first time when we proposed, in fact, to work on an extreme scenario that we called the 100% recycle scenario. That was interested in particularly to reframe, for example, the space of production as a different type of mixed-use space. More recently, in the study and the vision we realized for the Geneva agglomeration with a multidisciplinary team, that we continue this investigation of the embodied energy in terms of also a concentration of carbon footprint in the built surfaces. And this type of mapping, this is, for example, coming from Corentin Fivet, that is the director of the structural, let's say, laboratory in EPFL. And this is a map that, in my opinion, should be present in our maps in the future. I think it was Andrea speaking of the need of new mapping, of new representations, and I think that's absolutely a crucial point also in my opinion. And we think we should work on the idea of a new manual of the gaze. So the gaze has to be restructured, and we think we need not to explore, let's say, new themes, and a new manual could be the way to give visibility to this effort. The interest of this map is that, as you see, the highest, let's say, embodied carbon is not in the historic center or in the most, the densest and consolidated part of the city. The highest is in the, let's say, the periphery, is where, especially, let's say, concrete has been used. That is much more than the historical center. And this is emblematic, is already proposing an incredible value, let's say, problem, that from this perspective, the periphery is more valuable than, for example, the historical center, which means that the reservoir of embodied energy is the periphery, the recent part, the more recent part of the city. And this is just an example of how, by putting different themes, let's say, at the fore, you are in fact immediately touching a system of consolidated values, like, for example, the one about the ancient city is, of course, the most valuable part of the city, not from the point of view of the embodied energy and from the carbon footprint. And this was, of course, again, on the shoulders of research made even before on were trying to understand this porosity of the city, really at a very small scale. So using also type of representations like big models, for example, in order to understand how and why some of people were deciding finally to go back to a very degraded urban setting. So why it was so fundamental for them to reoccupy those spaces, and what were the qualities that they were looking for their living space, and how this was transforming systems, say, organization of space that were in the past with a very high mixed use. They were industrial and residential, and that today are, of course, less industrial, but still very multifunctional, and places of creation of living conditions. Until the imagining to really construct a map of guidelines for these different porosities. By porosities here I mean different attitude to be transformed, to be more malleable to certain transformations, that are in a direct relation also with the material consistency of those tissues. I mean, the different tissues, they have different capacity, ability to be adapted. And this is bringing back, in my opinion, some of the very old, let's say, reflection, again, from the end of the 50s, the 60s, and the beginning of the 70s. I take just one of them. That is about the analysis of material conditions. And I think that recycling, or let's say maybe better, reconditioning, to recondition the city, we have to be able to distinguish about what could last and what could guide the transformation, even if it will be transformed by this same transformation. And I would like to quote Carlo Imonino in 1973 about Pesaro, so the plan that the Gruppo Architettura realized in the 70s for the ancient center of Pesaro, where they built this fantastic map that was at that moment the collection of all the cadastral lots. So it's like the ground floor. I don't remember if this was the ground floor or the typical floor of the building, but where you see the walls, where you see the organization of space. And Imonino was saying material conditions means not only sociological stratification, but primarily the distribution of properties, differentiated production methods, the cost of rents and land, the ongoing transformation process. So, I mean, this is a list of things that we have practically forgotten, let's say. Very rarely you have this type of research. For example, just consider this differentiated production methods. This is what, for example, the map of Corentin is trying to show now, differentiated production methods. But consider also the distribution of properties, the cost of rent and land. So I think that there is really, classes maybe is a little more complicated today than in the 70s, but nevertheless, there is a transformation, a social transformation. And the idea, which I share, that the organization of space, so that, let's say, the city and the architecture of the city were important in order to work on these topics. And let's say from understanding of the material condition, which I think is today fundamental if we want to speak about the city as a renewable resource. There is no research or no, let's say, project on this without the understanding of the material conditions. But joined to that, there is another point, let's say the palimpsest. This is also a word you have been using yesterday and today. And here I want to remember a research always done at Iuav together with Lorenzo, Fabian, and again Chiara Cavalieri and Cecilia Furlan and others, in which we tried to map, say, this embodied energy, but also to read the territories through the lens of energy. So here you see a series of maps about the energy consumption. The first column, the second is the embodied energy. The energy you can imagine coming from recycling materials, and then the potential of energy production. And so the embodied energy, the blue one, is fundamental. This is a comparison between Paris and the diffuse city. So let's say a very dense city and a very diffuse city. We wanted to understand a little bit better from the energy perspective what was, let's say, in fact, the differences. And with this lens, we organized a series of workshops that were a way also to bring on the ground this more, say, theoretical approach on different parts of the diffuse city as being perfect places where to test these hypotheses. And about this, so here is all the territory. It's not just the built frame, but it's really the stratification of the entire territory. and the use of this metaphor of the palimpsest, on which I've recently reflected. So what about the consequences of this use of the palimpsest? That is in many discourses is still very, very present. But 3 points. The first is that by using this metaphor, you are engaged, in fact, with time. Time in 2 dimensions. The long term, so there is, let's say, you go through time, you look at the city as a stratification, and you discover different types, let's say, of effects or of transformations, and especially those related to the longue durée. Which means that the palimpsest brings histories and rationalities that are not only related to, say, specific events, but they're in a way placed outside of the events. And they describe a repetitive and immobile history. So what, in fact, Brodel defined as the longue durée. So long-term and longue durée are different things. And in the research we did on the territorial rationalities, on the reading of territorial rationalities, I think we were interested to understand exactly this repetitive and immobile history. That means the longue durée. And it's very crucial to consider this repetitive and immobile when you understand the water system of the Veneto region, of other countries. You understand that this is a kind of constant layer. Of course, it has been destroyed and dismantled in some ages, but fundamentally it has accompanied all the rest, all the events, all the changes. But that was there. It was repeating itself, and it was immobile. Of course, not perfectly immobile. On the contrary, the interest is exactly to detect what is moving inside an immobile history. The second point, the unintentional monument. In fact, when we speak of the palimpsest, we connect, we imagine relations, we over-interpret sometimes also the territory, because the territory is simply, in many occasions, just a lack of meaning, nonsensical relations. So the palimpsest is also the moment in which you bring those nonsensical relations, and you make them into the palimpsest inside you give a common frame to nonsensical relations. And I want to remember Riegel, that was using these terms, unintentional monument. For him, it was the unintentional monument marks instance that can be recognized in the development of human activity. So this unintentional monument, nevertheless, is fundamental because you have a glimpse of sense, let's say, inside this nonsensical, general nonsensical relation. You have a glimpse of sense, and that is the unintentional monument. So by working on palimpsest, I think we are also working on the recognition of those unintentional monuments. And the third point, which is maybe the one that has really a lot of consequences on our work, that is to get used to design in the second degree. So we work on top of designs, on top of nonsensical, let's say sometimes, design activity, sometimes, of course, with a lot of sense. But the point is that we are reworking on top of them. So it's a kind of second degree work. So it's not from scratch. And this is interesting because then we are working with common languages and common techniques that you can refine. You can be very sophisticated in your interpretation. But this is what we are doing. We are refining common languages and techniques. And this is something that is coming from the literary critic Jean Genet, that in writing is a very beautiful essay about Proust, Marcel Proust. The title of the essay is Proust Palimpsest. So where the palimpsest is Proust himself, and the recherche is an immense palimpsest in which you can find practically everything, all the universal literature, but of all kinds, not just the high literature, but also the low literature, the mass literature is inside. And the recherche that is considered one of the monuments of Western, let's say, European literature, is a palimpsest. So I think that for us to be inside this palimpsest metaphor means also to understand that our design is in the second degree. I'm going very, very slow, so I'm sure that I will never get to the end. Let's go to the second term that I use as life cycles. Life cycles and the importance of looking at the territories through those lens. Here I put some of the reflection we did on the horizontal metropolis and the interior peripheries. So when you speak of horizontal metropolis, you are not speaking of homogeneous conditions, but on the contrary, you are exactly pointing to the existence of interior peripheries, which open the need of a reflection on new development paths. So there is a territory, a vast region on which I'm working now since years, and on which I want to continue to work, because I think that by doing this kind of digging in deep, in specific explorations, we are constructing a kind of wider vision for this territory that is the Black Country and the Sillon Noir, the space where the first industrial revolution in Belgium and France and Germany appeared. And in particular, working along the Belgian part of the Sillon, so in the Walloon side, from Liège on one side, Namur, Charleroi, Mons, Val de Sambre, and of course, La Louvière. You see the distance from Brussels is more or less from every side, not much more than 1 hour, but this 1 hour is enough to be in a different condition, in a different economic and social condition. And is a country is very representative, because it's a country as many others. For example, another one that I've studied in the past, that is the Appalachian chain, much bigger, but nevertheless with the same very similar problems, maybe even worse than the European, let's say, side. And I think it's important to continue to imagine that there are visions that are possible for this territory, and that you accumulate, let's say, reflection by working on the different parts of it. So we work, for example, on the Val de Sambre, that is this territory in between bigger cities, so made of really small, tiny centers and villages, but with tons of polluted areas, and of course looking for new economies at different scales. This is, for example, in close to Liège. This is an urban project, let's say, but it's a project of regeneration of an industrial area where we are also working with the University of Liège about the possibility of bringing new economies inside this type of site, the research and different types of economy. And I would like to spend a moment on La Louvière, for which we have been proposing a projet de ville, so which means a kind of vision for the city that then is translated into more traditional planning instruments. So this place is a very specific place, as all places, let's say. But it's specific in the sense that you have an interesting mix between a very strong industrial history, but at the same time a very old and inhabited since the past, the long past territory. So where the palimpsest is a relevant figure, and where, let's say, the practices of the inhabitants are appropriating sites that are a little bit nonsensical, in the sense that you just find pieces of something that has remained there, and that is constructing new ecologies like the Terril, but also new places where new inhabitants are coming to live. Normally they are, in general, they are the poorest that are coming to live in La Louvière. La Louvière is attractive. Is its level of attraction is towards the poorest of the Brussels metropolis. Now that Brussels is booming, there is already an expulsion that is ongoing, and let's say the poorest are going in places like La Louvière. So an interesting reading of the palimpsest, where for us it was important to say, and this is a bit a question of value, so where the industrial history is really covering all the idea of stratification of this region, forgetting the fact that there is a past of the region that is as important, at least, or maybe is even more important than the rest. So that there is an environmental history that is larger than just the history of the industrial period. And this is important when you look at this territory that is still extremely qualitative, notwithstanding the presence of the pollution, notwithstanding the presence of a lot of infrastructures related to the industry, a territory that is a value. So in order to reflect with, it's the work also, of course, with the politicians, with the city, with the citizens, with the associations, in order to be sure that we were sharing, let's say, the same value system, we tested them by first discussing, not immediately inside a vision, but really as a kind of starting point, common point, and to discuss some criteria, to re-question the existing spaces. And we proposed to them 4 criteria. Let's say the first, to consider the risk, of course, and to give back a space related to the flooding and water to water. The second, to give a value to the protected areas and not consider just a kind of rhetorical tools that at the moment when you design, when you receive a proposal from a promoter, you don't remember that there is maybe a protected area. No, protected area is something that is important to consider. The fertile soils as a common good, on which, there is no discussion. Fertile soils must be protected. And the transport, so the collective and public transport, where this is not the existing transport, but the public transport that one can imagine if we make some effort on the public transport. I'm saying this because, as you know, there is a TOD on the transit-oriented development, but transit-oriented development has to be conceived specifically for this type of territories, very loosely inhabited, very distributed, and then, it's not, let's say, the traditional orthodox interpretation of the transit-oriented development. And we said, okay, let's see if we share the idea that the territory is a value, and if we can say that we start from these 4 criteria. And strangely, and we add, of course, also the valorization of the heritage, both the industrial heritage and the rest, and the embodied energy. And strangely enough, there was politically a strong consensus on this, even before starting to discuss, let's say, a direction to take, just as a first point. And then, and I will try to be very quick, then 3 fundamental, let's say, images guided the construction of the goals and the strategic goals for this territory. The first, to consider La Louvière with this beautiful territory and still very rich territory, a part of this larger vision for Wallonia, so as a Ville Park, let's say that the English translation is a little bit odd, so let's remain on the Ville Park. So supported by the presence of all this richness. I'm not entering into the detail. This is the idea of considering all this black country to be in the need to overcome this very strong and stigmatizing image in favor of a different one, where we use the term of park, let's say, in order to say it will be really different from the black country, and that we have been exploring also with the blue part of the Eurometropolis, Lille, Tournai, Courtrai, that is this region you see here. So imagining a large, let's say, continuity of this idea. This doesn't mean just to make a perimeter with say that's a park, but to share locally a vision that is common to all the sites that are along the former coal stretch. In the case of the Eurometropolis, it was interesting to consider that the water structure in the different dimensions was the one reorganizing the diffuse, let's say, metropolis of the 21st century. The way in which we have represented those elements, or we choose for a kind of iconic representation where we detected the icons, for example, of the landscape, including also, of course, the industrial say, heritage in the form of the working class houses, for example, and a very simple formulation where we propose for 2050 an integration inside this revised black country as a park at the European scale. And then, of course, from this, there are a lot of projects that can be imagined and realized, very specific projects on the very beautiful canal system, or this kind of central park that is encircled by the different settlements, or more generic themes related to the valorization of soils, etc. The second was, say, image is related to the very specific morphology of La Louvière. I mean, it's not very specific because it's very frequent along this in this region, but nevertheless is very specific. That we use the term of civic constellations because, of course, these cities are poor. So in the past years, the administration put some resources, let's say the resources they had, in requalifying a little bit the center of the city. La Louvière was a city that was invented for the industry, so it was just let's say much less older than the rest of the territory. But of course, this was at the cost of marginalizing even more the rest of the city. So the idea is that these constellations, the civic constellations, must be reformulated, and this is creating, this is the city that is made in this way. There is a strong capital there that is, of course, a social human capital and spatial capital. The human capital is in a way sleeping. So we have the problem here, as in many regions of this type of the sleeping human capital. This is a phenomenon that is studied by economists and sociologists. And we have a spatial capital that has to be requalified and rethought. So in between these two capitals, let's say a kind of alliance has to be imagined. This is a project, of course, made of the everyday space, and is connected to very small diffuse project that we have discussed with the people, the associations and the citizens in different moments, and that it's, let's say, wider than our intervention in this region. This is connected then to the first idea of the city park. Of course, creates very interesting aspects. The third. Okay. At different scales, let's say. The third point is the third image is a city with multiple and resilient economies. Of course, here the fundamental point is to abandon the only one industry, the only one type of industrial production, in favor of this multiplicity. There are different reasons why this is important in this moment, and it's also important to know that this region is losing in respect to the rest of the country. So between Wallonie and Flanders, Wallonie is getting poorer instead of getting richer, and inside this, La Louvière is, let's say, the worst case. And this has brought us to reflect together with the Idea Consulta, that is, can say, a place is made of some economists, and in particular one of them that is working with us since many years now. We have imagined this matrix in which we put in relation the different capitals that are in this place. The spatial and environmental capital, the human social capital, and the financial capital, and the different types of economies that we can imagine to articulate this monofunctional region and economy. And here, what is very important is that industrial economy remains. It is already, I mean, it is still there for a part. Something will remain of this type of economy, but there is a lot to be developed on the three others. That is the residential economy, the experiential economy, and the social and solidarity economy. The three of them are really touching the spatial capital in different ways. And this is where you can find a new connection, new alliances between, let's say, designers and economists and society. A relation, a connection that was very important, again, in the 60s and in the 70s, and that we have completely, or almost completely, lost. But yesterday you have invited economists, so this is not completely true what I'm saying. But nevertheless, there is a lot that is to be imagined, and where this connection between economy and space has to come back to the fundamentals, but also has to be enlarged to economies that are not inside, let's say, the system. Because when we speak of social and solidarity, we speak of economies that are outside, fundamentally, of the actual system. And this is where you understand, on one side, the potential, but also the need we have to reframe our system of values. Okay, let's say maybe I have to conclude here. I will skip the last point. This approach is very much related to the research we have been developing in these last years about the horizontal metropolis, and we are conducting. Let's say we are investigating this idea of horizontality also with PhD students that are reflecting on the shift that considering horizontality in design as a practice of design will need. When you start to say that you will not work in constructing peripheries, while very often we design constructing periphery, even reinforcing peripheries as peripheries. So when you refuse this position, that in a way is becoming more and more integrated. It's like if a periphery is a periphery, can be slightly better, but it's nevertheless a periphery. No, what if we think that peripheries can be avoided? What if we think that marginal, dependent, and servant territories can be avoided, while we construct today dependent and servant and marginal territories? What if we work and we design for equally livable urban-rural conditions? This doesn't mean to have a kind of distributed of everything. No, this just means to really reverse the way and do not accept existing conditions. So associating horizontal with the metropolis, we want to alert on the ongoing process of concentration, polarization, hierarchization. The case I've shown about La Louvière is one of them. And the hypothesis, the true hypothesis, is that design can work in reducing those dependence conditions. Concretely, in the working on the material conditions, we can make something that is different. So, as you understand, here I'm touching the question of the value shift. Recently, in a moment of reflection on Luxembourg 2050, Aristide was also part of this story. Luxembourg is a very rich country. It's very small and very rich and it's full of paradoxes. I mean, as small as full in paradoxes. It is going through transition as everybody else. And so we used, this device of comparing different world visions to understand finally, because the request was to reflect on the matrix of the transition. We have to be very careful, I think, about the question of matrix. So the matrix of the transition, we propose to look at this through these different perspectives, because in fact, everybody agrees about where we have to go towards the transition and towards sustainability. That's evident. But there is not so much consensus about how you can go there. And there are different trajectories that are still possible. And those different trajectories, they have different relations with space, with the energy consumption, with the economy, etc. So we compare in a quite, let's say, a little bit tentative and experimental way, 3 visions for Luxembourg 2050, oriented by 3 different world visions. The one is the cradle to cradle, the second is the degrowth, and the third is the deep ecology. This device we already used in 2 other cases. I'm not going back to them. But what is interesting, when you make this, you try, using existing research, you try to calculate what would be the impact in terms of CO2 emissions of the different perspectives. What is very interesting is that the first is the cradle to cradle, the second is the degrowth, and the third is the deep ecology. It is clear that the cradle to cradle, for example, especially if we imagine that in 2030 we should already be at a level of reduction that is enough to give the possibility for us to think about 2050. So we need to prove already in 2030 to be in a good position, because otherwise we will never be, probably, we will not have even the possibility to get to the 2050 future. So in also analyzing this intermediate point, which is very, very crucial to understand those different curves, we see very clearly that the cradle to cradle, that in any case, and this is what is already happening, needs an immense effort on infrastructure, new infrastructure, which means to raise the consumption, not to diminish the consumption and the emissions. For sure, this, even if you will gain something, you will remain quite high in terms of emissions and of energy consumptions. The degrowth is clearly the best, in the sense that you have to. We know that we can change our lifestyle in a very rapid way. Look at the COVID experience. No, we have changed in the space of 24 hours. So, for sure, the second, let's say, world vision, the growth, will bring us in 2030 in a better point in relation to the CO2 emissions. So let's say a radical diminishing of them, a radical drop. And the third one is a kind of in between, the deep ecology. So this one is directed from the idea that you change your perspective on the world, in the sense that you put ourselves not at the center, but you are around it, together with the other species. You consider them as, say, subjects. And there you are diminishing, you are reducing, not as much as in the first, because we need resources to regenerate also the environment that we have destroyed. And this is asking for energy and also for say, monetary resource. But in the long term is clearly the one that is, let's say, smoother, also socially, because this one is socially quite drastic, is probably the one that is the most resilient, because at the same time you are reinforcing your territory, so everybody will be in a better condition, and then it's probably the most resilient one in the long term. So this type of reflections, they open about a very fundamental point that was touched also yesterday. It is the decoupling. The decoupling, let's say, between economic growth and resource and energy consumption. So there is not a linear relation between economic growth and the energy consumption. And the second decoupling is between economic growth and happiness, individual and collective happiness. So again, there is a decoupling. Economic growth can continue, but your level of well-being finally is not really improving that much. So economists are reflecting on this paradox that is called the Easterlink paradox since at least the 70s. But that's a very interesting point because it's in a way bringing us to go back to these three world visions. Of course, considering that the future will be a moment of confrontation among those visions, let's say easy confrontations or very drastic and very heavy confrontation, very conflictual confrontations. We can make of this confrontation, I'm very convinced of this, a project of the confrontation itself. Nevertheless, I think there are some interesting reflections to do about the capacity, and this is something that also the European Union is clearly starting to clarify, that the circular economy or the circularity in itself may not deliver the transformation to sustainability, especially if it is interpreted as a way to fuel a growth strategy that leads to increased material consumption. So there are there is some kind of prudent attitude to maintain and to consider that if we intend a circular economy as a way not to change anything, not to maintain, in fact, our lifestyle, because nevertheless this loop will save us, then we are wrong. And this is, I think, more and more clear. Okay, I think that I will skip the last point that was related to the third term, inclusion, in which I wanted to speak of a life in common, the territory subject, and the weak structures. The conclusion of the talk was the last slide, in which I just wanted to speak about the fact that all this is, I think, clearly something that imposes to us a reflection on the transition as a new biopolitical project. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit too long.
Thank you very much, Professor Alavigano.
I'm trying to get out of this of the presentation, but for some reason I cannot. Okay, that's done.
Okay.
Okay, so now thank you very much for your presentation. It was very inspiring and useful useful, at least for us, for our research. And now we are going to introduce Professor Gunther Vogt, that I assume that is online and that can present his screen.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I think I have to reduce my presentation a little bit because I have to leave on 12:30. And how much time do we have now?
It's still 1 hour and 30 minutes, I guess, from now on. So I think we can make it.
Yeah, but the discussion will be around half an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, cool. Okay, let's start.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Can you see the animation?
Not yet, actually. Oh.
Can you see it?
Oh yeah, yeah. And also I can see also my face. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
No. Okay. Cool.
So, good morning, everybody. First of all, I show you a short film about glaciers in Europe, in the European alpine situation. And if you are talking about palimpsest, this is, in the end of the film, is a kind of palimpsest. It's relating to history, but we will have to think about the future. It's not only the history. And you see it was dramatically, the changes, the growing, the melting of the glacier. And I think that's really important that we relate, if we are talking about cities, that we are talking about the landscape. And this is an animation, and you will now shortly see your city, Venice. It's still growing and melting. And then when it's coming to around 6,000 years before us, you will see Venice on the right-hand side. It's still on land. I mean, it's like Milano. It's a normal city. And then it becomes an island because of this glacier melting process a long time ago, starting about 200,000 years ago. And now we are going closer to Venice, where you live. And you see you're still a city on the land. And I think that's important to understand the history of a landscape, and not only and the process and how, of course, in terms of time, it's a very long time, and you see the glaciers are more or less disappearing, and Venice arrives as an island. So that's due to the melting glaciers. And now you see the existing situation in the Alps, in France, Switzerland, Italy, and Austria and Germany. It's more or less done, so you don't have any glaciers anymore. But what is the future? And that's for us interesting. What is the future of this landscape and the whole landscape, not only the Alps? And we will publish a map in October this year, where we will show that the myth of Switzerland will disappear. You will no longer have mountains, white mountains covered by snow, but you will have around 800,200 new small lakes in the Alps, because this rest glacier will disappear and they will leave around 1,000 little lakes. not a white landscape in wintertime. It's a gray mountains mirroring in these little lakes. So a completely new landscape. And it's, of course, very important for countries like France, Italy, and Switzerland, and Austria in relation to tourism, because it will be a completely new perception of landscape. And when I look at your question, is the city still a renewable resource? I can just say yes. Is space still relevant? I can't understand this question. I'm quite often asked. I was asked a year ago in Harvard, and the German philosopher Gernot Böhme was really upset about this question, and he told the audience, how can you misunderstand Günther so much? Space will always be relevant. But the third question, I can tell you something. How will the urban project change? And that's very easy. We will have to think from the landscape, not only from the urbanization to the landscape, but vice versa. And I will show 3 projects from the office and not from the university. So we will have to think the cities in the future from the landscape. But in the end is for you the question, but what does it mean? I was asked by students from the Politecnico in Milano 2 years ago. And then I told them, listen, can you imagine the piazza in Siena, one of the most beautiful piazza in the world, is completely covered by a forest? And they really asked me why. And that's new. It's not, we are not only talking about resilience and sustainability and energy. The new themes are biodiversity and the climate change in relation to the cities. That means especially Mediterranean cities will have to change. And then I try to explain it not with a Mediterranean city, but let's say with Paris. Paris was the historical center, and then you had this transformation after the French Revolution, and Haussmann destroyed more than 20,000 buildings, and that's the real scale in the city. I mean, in 2 years or 2.5 years ago, around 5,000 people, elderly people, died in Paris because of the heat in the city center. So that means we will have to change the city dramatically. And it's really a question of what is the right scale. And this is really coming, let's say, in the end from the landscape projection to the city. And I show you now three projects we did in the office, not at ETH. The first one is Farini in Milan. Competition we won together with OMA, Rem Koolhaas, two large sites in Milan, one owner, and that's always helpful if you only have one owner. So it's a railway company in Italy owns it, and our approach, and as you see it here, it's always in the beginning, even if you're working in the city center, and you will see it in the second project with Berlin, we always start from outside, from the landscape. And what does it mean, such a change in a city seen from the landscape? And if you work in northern Italy, the Alps are really relevant. We did a lot of studies all around the Alps in France, in Lyon, Marseille, Milan, of course, and Ljubljana. What is the relationship to the hinterland or this landscape behind these big cities just around the Alps? You could make it very easy and say, yeah, it's a kind of central park for all these cities, and you have a lot of abandonment, especially around Torino with Fiat. So many people leaving the Alps and working in the industry after the Second World War. But what is the relationship, for instance, of Milan or even Venice, very close to the Alps, because it's in a process of abandonment. But what does it mean? Because we are constantly talking in every Congress. I hear, in 2050, 50% of the world population will live in cities. But my question is then, but what happens with the landscape? And that's a really interesting question for all these 7 countries around this real center in Europe. But it's not the center of Europe, it is the center of Western Europe, because the center of Europe is meanwhile east of Berlin and no longer here as it was before 1989. And that's really important. And my problem a bit is, since I'm involved in many research projects at CETH as well, we are constantly doing mapping, and we don't have an idea, or we don't have let's say a vision how it could be in the future. And you had it in Italy with Superstudio, or in the UK with Archigram, where they formulated in the 60s a kind of vision. And that's a bit, for me, a problem, that we lose this really big scale approach. And I think that will be extremely important, especially if I see the abandonment in Italy. Of course, further south, it's much stronger in Apulia and Sicilia and all these in the south of Italy, where we have completely abandoned landscape. But the real question is, what happens with this landscape? And I think this exchange between the city and the landscape will become more important. And for me, landscape is a cultural production. And then is the city a renewable resource? I have to say yes, because we need the intellectual potential of the city to rethink the landscape in future. And I'm going through now very quickly through this project in Milan. And of course, it's a lot of research. And of course, we are doing mapping as well. And we really go very close to a city, but from outside, not from inside. And that's really important. So this different approach. And of course, for us, it's very important to do field trips, to have a real experience. I think, especially with my students, I see they don't have real experience even with cities and with landscape. It's more a digital, let's say, experience. And then to go on this side, to see this landscape, or these cities where we are working in. So we found on the top right, you see a building not finished by Aldo Rossi. It was a railway station, planned as a railway station. And you see it's completely abandoned in the middle of the city. And we have these processes in the landscape and in the cities. And that's really interesting. And of course, when we are talking about climate change, what you see here, you don't see, I see it, perhaps you don't see it, no native species. So that means you have a lot of invasive species, especially in northern Italy, because the temperature is higher than in northern Europe. So that's an invitation to these invasive species to inhabit these leftover spaces. And this will change the landscape completely. When I was a student and I took the train from Zurich to Milan, it was completely different to today. If I look out today from the train, I only see invasive species. That means a completely different landscape than at the time when I was a student. And this will change dramatically. And so, of course, we are looking on the cultural landscape as well, not only the natural landscape. And what's really important in northern Italy, as you saw it in this little film, is hydrology. And we looked really careful to the hydrology in the Po region, and you see the scale. The project in the end is in Milan, but our approach is not even regional, you could say half national in Italy. And then we found out there is a topographical difference between the north of Milan, where you have all the industry, and the south, where you have a large agricultural production of rice. And it's around 10 meters of difference in terms of topography. And that made it for us really interesting. And it's not in the middle of the city, but in the south of the city, where you have completely different conditions for the landscape. And this was then published in many Italian newspapers. In the future, we will have to discuss Milan, the blue south, and the green north. And you see our project, these are two projects in one competition. The blue one, rectangle on the left-hand side, and the green in the middle of the top. And completely different approaches. And we found it very interesting to deal with it's dry or it's wet. So let's start with wet in the south, and you know it, all these channels in Milan by Leonardo da Vinci, and finally really big infrastructure projects in the past, but still very important in the city of Milan, and nowadays a part of the urban perception. And you still have a lot of streets where underneath is a channel or a former river, and this was really important. So that when you are talking about the palimpsest, I would say the palimpsest is already there. You just have to see it and to find it. And then we relate it to the history of the 20th century. The very famous airport where the airplanes landed on water, so in the east of Milan. And so there is a kind of tradition. And if you are talking about the palimpsest in the sense of Andrea Corbeau, I mean, the palimpsest is really there. You just have to find it or to identify it. And for us, it was interesting for our project to say, yes, in the south, there are big infrastructure projects like the Leonardo da Vinci canals, or here's the airport in the early 20th century, but big infrastructure project with water. And so we proposed, you see Aldo Rossi's building is finally built, but not as a railway station. The question in the competition was that this area has to be 100% green. No buildings, additional buildings, and that's really new as an approach. And I found it very interesting because Milan has a lot of experience with urban developments, but here I really think it was the first time in Europe that the city said, let's start with the landscape. So it's 100% green and no buildings. Because you know all these urban projects in Milan, they did an urban design competition, afterwards architectural competitions, and afterwards you have landscape competition, but then you have just leftover spaces. And here it was very clear from the beginning that the landscape is more important. And you see this canal in the middle. Is on the right-hand side, you see the canal by Leonardo da Vinci. So we added another one, more, I think 3 kilometers long. But I was really shocked when I saw the competition brief that the air, the soil, everything is completely polluted and the water, of course, as well. It's so polluted, I couldn't believe how strong it is. And I have a student who did a map about northern Italy, and he overlapped the people dying because of COVID and the and the pollution, the air pollution. And it's exactly the same between Milan and Bergamo. And so it was very strange for us that this water is coming from Switzerland and it's so polluted that you cannot even bath inside. And so we proposed a kind of cleaning canal, and it has to be it is a kind of infrastructure, or it is an infrastructure. It's not really a canal for ship, but it's a canal to clean the water. And of course, it's in the same time a park. And I think in the future we will have, or we need in the planning, this overlapping of different disciplines, especially infrastructure, landscape, and city. And that's really the future, that we don't think in a modernist way. Let's say here you could say, yeah, we just plan a park or we design a park, but this is not interesting. We need this overlap of different disciplines, and here it's infrastructure, so this clean water cleaning system, and a park. And the other one completely dry, more in the city. And again, here it was the question or the demand of the city of Milan to have 60% green. The rest 40% have to be 30% green. But you see, for the architects, there is still a lot to build. It's not really that you cannot build. But what is important is that you think from the landscape. And here, for instance, are introduced a cleaning system, not for water, but for soil. It will stay around 30 years to decontaminate all the soil along the railway station, because we have to have a barrier or a distance to the railway lines. And there it will be a cleaning, let's say a cleaning machine for soil. And it will take about 30 years, but you can still build a new city. And I think that's still possible. And of course, it's more concentrated. And that's important when you look at all over Europe, the growth of the cities, it's extremely strong. And as you see London or the Benelux, what Paola Vigano just showed before, or northern Italy, there's the question is really important. How do we handle the landscape? And when you look on Germany, for instance, I would say 60-70% of Germany are national parks. Germany is a kind of national park. And that's really the difference to the rest of Europe. And especially in Italy, you see there are not so many landscapes protected. But personally, I don't see the future in preserve the landscape. I think we should have a more active role. How do we develop in the future the landscape? And here's the next one. It's Berlin. There was a competition last year, an international competition. It was 100 years of Great Berlin. It's between 1920 and 2020. And so the Association of Engineers and Architects organized an international competition. We won together with an architect and a structural or an engineering company. What could be the future in the next 50 years in Berlin? And there is a long tradition in Berlin to have a vision about how is our future. And I mentioned perhaps Ungers, who did this wonderful book about the archipelago. But this was before Germany was unified, and it was about Western Germany. And then in 1990s, there was a wonderful exhibition, Visions for Berlin, where, for instance, Herzog and de Meuron proposed around the Tiergartens, the Central Park, 4 buildings, 1 kilometer long, 1 kilometer high. So as a kind of vision for the future, so that means you have to densify it. But my problem with this densification is always we lose a lot of free open spaces all over Europe, because it's good, I'm not against it, so that we densify, we urbanize the center more. But then what again, like in the landscape, what is the role of the free open space? And that's a real discussion. We have to deal, urban planners, architects, engineers, and landscape architects. And this was, you see it in 1910s, they already had a kind of vision for Berlin, but as you can see, it was more the forests, agricultural land, and the infrastructure. It wasn't really about the city. And we really started in our project with the city itself. Let's start from the outside. And of course, the scale is not the city of Berlin. It's this scale is bigger than Switzerland, for instance. And that's really more and more on a topic, so that the scale is getting bigger. So, and that's really good, I think, that we really start from the landscape. And of course, I have to be very short now, but you see the difference between the north on top and the south underneath, where you have in the south a kind of a lake landscape with forests, and in the north, due to the communist time, more intensive agricultural land. So it's a kind of different morphology of the hinterland or the surrounding landscape of Berlin. And then with all the parks again, and we are getting closer and closer, and of course the protected landscapes, as I already mentioned, where we cannot do so much, but that's a big problem for us. We would like to activate the landscape much more. We shouldn't protect every landscape and not to build there, but that we have a kind of idea how to go on in the future. And then what I already mentioned, this idea of the cultural landscape. And what we found out, that this is the white is the urbanized area. What we found out that this difference between East Berlin and West Berlin, we should really deal with it. That means in East Berlin, you have farms, 10,000 hectares. Can you imagine? These are really big farms. And you have only one landowner. That means the government owns all this land, but big agricultural fields. And they are not intensively used. And so we propose that we use this land in a bit like you have it in the UK. It's a mixture between landscape, agriculture, and protection. So you still have animals being grown there and so on, but at the same time, it's a kind of park close to the city of Berlin. So again, an overlapping of agriculture and landscape architecture. And so this was the approach. And of course, in the end, we got very close to the city center of Berlin. And on the right-hand side, this blue area is the airfield of Tempelhof. And you find, or even in Schöneberg on the left, you find these large-scale areas in the city center. And the airport field is very close to the city center. But what is the difference in color? It's producing cold air. Since it's just a meadow, it's much more producing than all the forests around Berlin, because it's very easy to explain. It's the surface of the grass is much bigger than the surface of the leaves of a forest. So you have a cold air production in the city center. And how do you deal now with this? I declared it as an inner landscape instead of an outside landscape. And the director of the Berlin planning authority was so upset that I said there is landscape in the city. And you see this yellow banana-shaped building. It's a huge building for the former airport. And we proposed that we shouldn't build there. and especially not on the edge, because the cold air has to flow into the city center, and we really keep it as a landscape and not as a traditional park. So you can find landscape still in European cities inside. And then that's the end, what you are perhaps more interested in, where we showed, okay, there is the urban densification possible, and that's the yellow one. Instead of the dark red is the city center, and then the red after the Second World War, and the yellow one is our proposal. There can urbanization happens in relation with the surrounding landscape. So the last one, again in Germany. When you're saying this palimpsest, when you're focused on the palimpsest, what we really like when we work in the European cities, and in Hamburg, for instance, the tradition of the Volkspark by Leberecht Micke, Bruno Taut in the 1920s. So this left-wing architects and landscape architects found out a new type of park, very robust. The center is empty, and the edge is really intense. You can use it as a kiosk, as a playground, whatever. And so in Hamburg, when we started this project, we did a really research about this. And this is I would say, a memory of the city. I mean, all citizens in Hamburg knows, if you are talking about the Volkspark, what it means. It's very open. It's for everybody. You can do many different things. You can play football. You can sit there and whatever. And it really started there. And this was our starting point for this competition we won last year with Herzog and Domeron. It's perhaps you know the Hafen City in Hamburg. It's a transformation of a harbor, and now it's over the river Elbe. It's a new city instead of a harbor. And this we really, and here I can of course not show all our analysis. But it's more a cartographic process than a mapping process, I would say. So we really, the dark green areas and the different greens show something. So we already classified it. It's not like a zoning plan or just on mapping and saying there it's green, here it's not green, but what are the conditions of these green public areas? And that's the existing harbor, and this will be a transformation in the next 20 years into a new city. As a Hafen City on the top, you see it's growing, and this will be a transformation over the next 20 years. And of course, it has a lot to do with existing nature and what is protected, and that's mainly in water and not on land. And you can see it here, and this is the whole project. And what I really want from the other side, what I really want to explain, so that we are not copying when we are saying that we are in relation to the history, and you see it's a big park and it promenades and courtyards and so on. But the most important is on the low level. This is an existing huge roof. It's 400 meters, 500 meters long and 40 meters wide. It's before the containers, when the ships arrived, they had to bring all the things they delivered to Hamburg under a protecting roof. And afterwards the containers arrived, so it was no longer used. And we proposed, together with Herzog and Domeron, they are really interested in what is public space today. And we proposed to keep this roof and to add it to the park. So we have two different conditions of public space, and the public space in the future is no, and that's important for the cities. It's no longer only a plaza or a park. It can be in a building, or like say here under a roof. And so we propose that it has to be curated. Somebody, not us or the architects, somebody has to curate it. Is it cultural artists, whatever? And it's part of the public space. And you see it here in the section. It's just near our park, so that we propose two different conditions of public space. And I think, therefore, the city is still a resource for new ideas. And I really think we need, like you are living or studying in Venice, we need this intellectual resource of the city. And how can we fill such a space, especially in these weather conditions in Hamburg? So you can, and again, the relationship is not for the new city we are building and designing. Of course, the scale is relating to the whole city of Hamburg, because especially because of this roof, and in addition to the park and the program under the roof and in the park, it's the relationship is to the whole city and not only to this new quarter in Hamburg. And we transform the existing harbors into, for us, these water areas are more or less parks. So we just transformed it, and we, in the perception of the people living there, it will be a kind of park, since it's no longer used for as a harbor. So we just transformed it into a, and of course it has a lot to do with nature, existing nature there, and protected nature as well. And that's the last one, where you see the roof in the middle and this park. And I think that's really the future. And I'm open to discussion now. And I think we should look a bit on the time, so that we still have a bit for question and answer now.
Okay, I think that's brilliant.
Thank you. So if you want, we can pass the word to Margherita Manfra or Aristide Athanasiadis. Looking at the order, we have Aristide's intervention right now. If you want, you can activate your microphone.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for these two presentations. Thanks a lot for the invitation as well. I'll try as much as possible to figure out what were the interesting points that I heard from both of these presentations, and just give some personal insights as well, and to answer your question, which is, so how will the urban project change? And well, from what end, there is another underlying question, which is the city a renewable resource? So these are two questions or hypotheses that need to be, I think, reformulated or rethought, especially when we talk about the city. What is a city, and what does a city mean in the 21st century? And so there is a redefinition that needs to be discussed, because a city is only as good as the historical, technological, economic, environmental context it lies within. And Paola mentioned it within the longue durée, that you have to see things in the perspective. Gunther also mentioned things. What is the relationship between the city and its spatial context? So there is a temporal context, there is a spatial context, there is many other contexts that we need to put together there. So in that sense, how will the urban project change in this 21st century context? Well, we know the context that we're living in. We're living in a highly disrupted present, with economic crisis, with environmental crisis, with big societal crisis. And of course, it's not new. I mean, every decade or every century, these crises exist. So if you go back to Manchester when the Industrial Revolution was happening, there was a social unrest, there was an environmental unrest. One of the books of Hegel back in the day was about the pollution in Manchester. So it's not new what we're facing. The urgency and the is different. The scale, the magnitude is different, but we're experiencing something that's, and well, the threat to our species also seems to be very imminent. Although this was also present, Malthus also had this in the Industrial Revolution. We could also send these elements. So if we recognize that we have always lived and had to negotiate with many crises, the idea is, what are those crises today and how do we deal with them? And therefore, is the city a renewable resource? Also, we need to answer it to that sense. So when I was thinking, is it a renewable resource? I had to think in two dimensions. I was thinking, what are the resources attached to a city, and is the city a resource? So you can always think as a local resource or a global resource. Where does that fit in the scale? But also, what are the limited and abundant resources that we have within cities? So it was mentioned in the discussions, ideas of cities are abundant. So that's one resource that cities can certainly provide. Cities in the past were also the place of social and spatial specialization. And in that sense, we pushed industry away, we pushed agriculture away, we pushed everything away to make space for accumulation, for making space for specialization. And this was more or less the definition of a city, right? I mean, a city is defined by social spatial specialization. But does that, in the horizontal metropolis of Paola, make sense today? And when we talked about the landscape, I liked very much that we saw zoomed out maps of entire Europe. But of course, what we need is to zoom out even further to the planetary scale, because none of the metals, or just a tiny fraction of metals, are local. If we talk about lithium, which is in most of our devices in order to communicate today, do not come from Europe. Well, there is a lithium mine that is planned for Portugal, but I don't know if that's going to happen. And so I would like to think of this in the future as zooming further out and talking about metabolic landscapes at a planetary scale, and not at a European scale, not at a metropolitan scale, because it does not make sense to talk about a metropolis, even a horizontal metropolis, if we do not take the real hinterland, which is the planetary one. And so the question is then, what is the role of the architect, the urban planner, the landscape architect for the 21st century? And I think it's much harder than the one of the 20th century, because while construction materials increased by 50 times from the beginning of the 20th century to today, so we extract today 50 times more materials per year than we did at the early 20th century. So now the architect, the planner, the landscape architect needs to figure out, how do I deal with this mess that we're within? How do I negotiate between challenges? And how do I not construct? What is my position in not constructing? How do I add value to a city without with limiting my physical intervention, with limiting my my footprint, let's say? And so that's quite tricky, because we have been, educated to build something. That is the profession of the architect, is to build something. But now it's not anymore, or it should not be anymore. So I think of these disciplines as a mediator, as a person that understands the space and that can present the challenges, the transversal challenges that exist into the client, into the people that want to get all of this information, and reframing questions. So that is one piece. They need to negotiate and all of that, but they also need the right tools to do so. And we talked about it. So we need tools to read the city. We need tools to map the city, and we need these tools to collaborate between people. And such tools exist, although they're not yet consolidated by a number of people. We have tried to develop such tools with Metabolism of Cities, which are open source tools that have layers and that you can visualize the city in it. If we have time, I'll show that later. And I think these disciplines are very well positioned because they understand the city as a layer. They understand the city as a palimpsest. So it's not something that we need to reframe, but we need to put new orders of magnitude. We need that the architect knows about materials, knows about extraction, knows about the environment, knows that 1 square kilometer of a city equals X amount of materials, equals, so what was it, approximately 1 million tons of materials, or 10 million gigajoules. So they need to be fluent in many different languages that surpass the function, surpass the beauty, surpass, the previous, negotiation of dimensions that architecture had. So the architect always had to negotiate between dimensions and between, realities and priorities, but we need to just reformulate them. And for that, I think it's going to be an exciting decade or 2 decades for architects to redevelop themselves. So I think that's 10 minutes. I don't know if that was precisely what you were looking for, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know what is Giacomo. Yeah, thank you very much, Alessia. Really, I think you touched a lot of points. But now I would like to go directly to Margherita Manfra, so I give you the stage. And then after that, there's going to be Thomas Telmach. And then we're going to go back to the stage to Professor Paola Vigano and Professor Gunther Vogt in order to reopen the discussion between all these insights that we got. And then we can, I highly suggest to all the audience here, if they want to do some questions, please raise your hand. There is a button on the top, so you can really raise your hand, so we'll be able to give you a voice. So, Margherita Manfra, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, everybody. Good morning. And thank you for the invitation and also for the previous contribution, because they were really amazing. I think I feel pretty familiar with this kind of themes I work on since 10 years, but from different point of view. So I think this shifting in perspective on the same context, it's really, really important. Moreover, because we are thinking about the city that is a palimpsest, so that is layered and has different contribution. So first of all, I can start from the 2 points you discussed yesterday and today. So the city as a resource and the project in contemporary city. Again, it's familiar to me because when we started, we were students. It was 11 years ago right now, and we started using different urban wastes. We called the discarded materials together with abandoned spaces and to forgotten collective habits. And we discovered that we can put together all these kind of wastes and to bring out synergies and new perspective to how can the public spaces in the city can be used. On the other hand is the role of the architect that Aristide was saying before, and how this is not just a creative job, but it's something we had a metaphor we used several times, that is the one of the water dozer. So somebody that has to found streams and to detect energies buried down in the floor and to let them emerge. So it's a kind of collaborative system in which architecture has to be helped from different disciplines to go to the goal. Moreover, if we talk about public realm and public situation, so where people are involved directly in inhabiting the city. And another point I would like to add to the discussion is that the statement, so the city is a renewable resource, I think it is, but we have to consider another point. Moreover, this year that we are living in this kind of crazy situation, because if the city is more and more shaped by sudden instances, we have to think about the how to deal with the unexpected during processes. So how to embrace the unexpected, and to leave space to this into the project. So for us in our practice, it doesn't mean to neglect the generative nature of the process of the project, but instead to give, for example, to leave space for the inhabitants to modify and to create spaces that can react to the movement of the inhabitants. So the idea is that the project has to change, and we are currently making an attempt. It is a public space. We are building a square right now, but together we are building with a multidisciplinary team a process to involve citizens in this process, in this building. And for us, so building public space doesn't mean just a purpose, but also a modus operandi. So we used to build together with the inhabitants, because participation is not just to ask people what do they want, but is to let them be informed of what's going on and to let them participate in a way to appropriate of the places they live in. So the idea is, as I was saying, that building as a verb in this case becomes a meiotic action that explores, questions, and involves local resources, with the aim of steering territories through inclusive and incremental processes of urban renewal. So I think the project that Paula and Gunther showed before, they're working on the same aim, but on a bigger scale, so a longer perspective. For example, it was said before that we have to transform our tools. We are trying to do it through the existing situation, through the existing rules, for example. But I ask you, how do you deal with this kind of unexpected situation, like the pandemic, for example? It's just the latest and more evident situation, but it's something unexpected, and we have to react to it. So how do these kind of processes can react and be adapted to the situation? And then that's another point, just also thinking about what we are working on in your PhDs, is exactly the adaptation, but not just to climate change, but also to human changes, because we said that we are living in a world that is complex and everything is linked to each other. So if we have a problem right now, it's also because of climate changes, and also because of human situation, and also because of political and economical and what else. And so the idea is our tool have to be more complex, and we have to have different alliances during our profession. Another point is the critical process, so the shifting in point of view. Everything has to be seen from another perspective. As Gunther said, the palimpsest is still there, it is already there. We just have to see it, to detect it, and to use the traces that we can find in the territories in the better way we are capable of. And yes, I think once again that big scale projects can be a driving force for this transformation. On the other hand, also smaller interventions have to deal with the same aim. So the interscalar point you are stating in the masterclass is a point. How do we work together in different scale, in different times, in different contexts to get together to our goal? That's it.
Okay, thank you for intervention. I give word right now to Thomas Stelmach, if you want to intervene.
Thank you very much. I'll react, but I also let some pictures run in the background. I hope you can see them now. I mean, first of all, thanks for the invitation and for hosting University of Venice. I'm very grateful, and thanks for the interesting inputs. I'd like to try to build this big bridge between Aristide's comments on the global challenge and what Margherita said, dealing with the unexpected and very local action. Also, in the invitation, Andrea asked me to give a bit the perspective of UN Habitat and, of course, also the perspective of our office. Even though, if I'm honest, I feel here a bit that I'm preaching to the choir, because usually I am preaching to deal with the nature, to go for integrated planning. But we have talking about this all day so far, and I'm actually very happy about that. What you see in the background is a project that we did together with the United Nations, Habitat, that's the settlement program, in 5 cities in the Philippines, which is one of the nations most affected by climate change, having, as you can see here, over 6,000 islands, and the challenge both of increased precipitation, but also typhoons from the coast. What is the global challenge overall? What is the challenges that we all have in common? Basically, we are still looking at rapid population growth, of course, in the global south, much more than in Europe, but even we feel it, not through indigenous population growth maybe, but through migration. An even steeper increase in resource consumptions. So there are more people, but even more, they are becoming wealthier, which per se is not a problem, but a good thing. But of course, they consume more resources. And all that is exacerbated by climate change. So this is what we need to address. And there, the answer, interestingly, is the city. So yeah, the city is a renewable resource, or we need to shape it in a way that it becomes renewable, to think about it in an integrated way. And this is also one of the main arguments that we are making at UN Habitat, so that urbanization actually can be good. It is not necessarily good. Of course, the city with the history of pollution, you mentioned Manchester, etc., traditionally often has been the source of problem and seen as a source of poverty, while actually the opposite is true if designed and managed in a proper way. And this is also what was formulated, what you see here in the New Urban Agenda in 2016, 2017, and of course you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 11, cities. So what do we do there at UN Habitat? Of course, we try to preach or transmit in a very simple way this idea that we have discussed here, that of course we do nowadays not need to start as in traditional planning with the infrastructure, but look at the environment first. And this is what we try to communicate here. But I think in the context of today, it is important to say that we should go one step further to actually see the systems of urban settlements, of the biosystems, of the natural environment, the topography, the geology, as one integrated system that needs to be thought together. At UN Habitat, it skipped ahead, we are saying, of course, there is the spatial component. So yes, space absolutely is still relevant. That's the planning design component here. But of course, we need to as much also look at the processes that shape the city, which is the economy, which is the financial flows, but also needs to be addressed through legislation and through the right governance approaches. And from there, we often give, with UN Habitat, a very simple rules of thumb to steer cities towards a good organization. The deal mix, walkability, public space quality, etc. And this is also what we are discussing very much here in the office at the moment. So there is the idea to take the nature into account in urban systems. But let me also say 1 or 2 words about the unpredictability. Because how to deal what you said, Margarita, because resilience is the answer to unpredictability. So if we build systems that can adapt and deal with change, then automatically we can deal with the unpredicted, even though we cannot predict it, evidently. This, for example, is a curve of the population development in Berlin. And you can even just see in this curve the big changes in history, the big disasters, world wars, migration, reunification, just in that simple diagram. A wall has been built, nobody predicted that. And the recent sudden influx of refugees was also not predicted. So in that context, I also added some slides of the Berlin-Brandenburg competition, where I was very happy to see the other proposal, where we also got awarded, where a systemic approach of seeing the city is needed. In this case, for example, we said, look, we cannot predict these sudden changes in economy, in migration, but what we need to shape is a system that can absorb these changes. In this case, for the case of Berlin-Brandenburg, you can see that the city almost completely disappears. The houses, the buildings of Berlin and the Brandenburg towns are still there, but we looked much more at the systems of food production in yellow, of agriculture. We look much more at the blue-green system of the water cycles, because if we shape that in a way that the city, no matter if the economy booms or not, if there's more migration or less, can absorb the changes, especially the changes that we already know about, which mainly is climate change, then definitely we can deal with the future. So there are, of course, spatial consequences. Let's be clear about that. The space does not disappear, but the answer needs to be integrated. And I think and that is the question to the round maybe also, if we look at the coming decade, the big challenge is the operationalization. Because we have framed in the SDGs, in the New Urban Agenda, but also in the comments of today, I think we have framed the challenges quite clearly. We also know the way forward. We know that this integrated, nature-driven approach is essential, but still often the struggle is the implementation, so the local action. So there again, I would really like to encourage you all, also after you finish your research and go into your professions, to think about the link, how these clear objectives that we have can be operationalized in the local reality of the cities and of the people today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm going to share temporarily the screen again.
Yes, please do that. I'm trying to leave the screen sharing to here.
Okay, and sorry, wait a second. At the end of this session, we would like to remind that
Giacomo.
the last. Sorry.
I think we.
Yeah, we have enough time yet to discuss. Sorry again.
Yeah. We have half an hour, and I suggest to have a turn with our lecturer if they want to reply, and then to have a short session for the question from the public, then from us. So keep in mind we have half an hour.
Okay, so maybe I jump into the conversation. And of course, I thank Aristide and Margherita and Thomas for the contributions. Yes, we have the impression that we more or less we agree, but I'm really not. I'm never convinced. I'm all very skeptical about the the consensus and agreements. In the sense that, yes, as I said before, we want to get to the same point. You know, we are convinced that, of course, that we have to revise our methods to think and design differently. But in the concrete realization and transformation of the city, we see how much still is producing contradictory, unequivocally contradictory situations. And of course, I think this is to Aristide and also to Margherita, I think it's not in the interest of nobody of constructing an opposition between local scale, small scale, and planetary scale. No, I think that, of course, we need to work fluidly among these scales. And the risk of becoming just planetary, bird's view, or the risk of being very, very blind because you are into one context only, it's always present. And of course, I think we really have to work on this fluidity of scales and of relations. And we are interested in strategies and in tactics. We need to affirm the need of both. We need, say, strategic adaptations. We need structural changes, and we need a lot of small adaptations and, let's say, local tactics, or even personal, individual tactics to adapt. And I think that this could be one of the points of the characters of design in this period should be exactly this one, not to oppose, but really to work, taking the best out of, because I am convinced that the small adaptations and a tactical, let's say, urbanism is very important in this period. At the same time, we have to maintain space and, let's say, space, conceptual space and concrete space for a deep debate about the structural adaptations, where, in fact, as I was saying before, the world views are really coming together, and they have to find a socle. They have to find a ground for a possible dialogue. So, for example, this is a point to Thomas. How do you consider this presence of different worldviews? And my conviction is that the future will not be the selection of one of these worldviews, or let's say the one winning over the others, but that is in fact exactly in this negotiation, in this dialogue, that you can construct something interesting, but in an explicit way, not just as a result of a power game that is largely, let's say, hidden, but accepting the idea of a common discussion. The point of resilience of uncertainty is, I think, is that digging into the resilience concept, you understand that you have to deal with problems without a solution. We are always in the position to say, okay, we will find a solution. Maybe also a small solution, a local solution or something. But maybe this is not true. Maybe there is no solution. And we have to live with that. For me, the question of uncertainty is also this. And we are facing more and more situations where, in fact, maybe there is not really a solution. Or I don't know, there is a solution only if you reframe completely the theme, which means only if you look at the theme from a different perspective and you revise your system of values. Otherwise, there is not a solution. And for example, if I can answer with a question, in the small, or in this type of tactical adaptation, I think that's an important point. How to deal with the situation that have no solutions, or also how to deal with the different worldviews that they are in a way legitimate, at least in a pluralistic view of the world, they have their legitimation.
Yeah, if I may react, I'm actually very glad how you framed the issue, and I'm very glad that there's no solution, not in a horribly pessimistic sense, but actually in the sense that there is no solution, but there's a constant process of finding solutions, but not really solving. Because when we had utopian absolutist approaches to urban development, it usually went very badly. If one planner thought, okay, I have now the ideal city, let's build it. It never worked out, at least never in the way it was planned. So the answer is indeed in the process, in the in-between. Even if I sound like a structuralist now, I think this is actually it. And it is also in building these bridges. So for example, if we look at very localized solutions, yes, they're useful, and some other, let's say, a local approach to water storage to solve climate change challenges, community-driven, all wonderful. But still, maybe the scale is not big enough to answer the issue. Then we have the large infrastructures, also fine, but how can they be financed, especially if we look at communities in the global south? So what we need to build is processes and chains of value, how small solutions can be scaled up and integrated with the larger solutions to create a system. And this is the big question at the moment.
Thank you very much. We have other answers, or we can go with other questions if you want.
I would like to add a question. I was thinking about listening to your presentation, and also thinking about our research and not also mine, but also the ones of my colleagues, Alessia, Andrea, and Giacomo. And there's one point of convergence of our research we have not already said, which is the relevance of the soil as a place and as a device to reframe the way we are producing the city, but also as the spatial device to radical rethink some, for example, the way we stay together in the public space, but also thinking about ecological transition. So the question is about is the soil relevant as a device for the project of the transition? And I think I can collect the question that were posed online. So we have two questions, one by Federica Vingelli.
Yes, and first we have Elvira Pietrobon that ask what about the political dimension of urban planning? What if the interscalar and interdisciplinary dimension of the project be the base for general discussion in the shared group of political decision?
And the
second one. Prego.
Is about it's from Federica Vingelli. Good morning and thank you for the interesting lectures. The issues of the spatial limits of the circular city system refer to the concept that yesterday Professor Russo expressed of endogenous regeneration, where the material values of the circular project derive from local processes and wasted landscape. I would like to ask the speakers how this affects the question of the shape of the recycled city. Could we define it as a neo-vernacular project where the shape of the city depends on local waste materials more than the modern city, as it was in the ancient city where the relationship between the underground and the shape of the topside city above was fundamental? Thank you.
We have lost our second speaker.
Yeah,
I can see.
Yeah.
At some point, no?
Okay. I see, but also the hand raised by Thomas and Aristide. I don't know if they want to.
Yeah, and someone has the microphone open with the hammering point. Maybe whoever that is can mute the microphone. If I don't take too much speaking time, I can try to react at least to the first two questions. Oh, we have Günther back. That's very nice. If you mean, Luca, if you mean by soil, if you mean not only the earth itself, but also the land question of ownership, then I can actually link that to the first question from the audience, because indeed the land question and the ownership and how it is managed, or if it is even owned, if it is a land lease or other module of city and housing production, is essential and fundamentally political. It is so important because it always makes me very nervous if I hear neoliberal approaches of regarding to urban growth and city management, because the answer there is usual, well, the market will solve the problem, demand supply, you know. But you cannot produce more land. You cannot produce more downtown area. It is limited. So these ultimate function of the market that works, let's say, acceptably well, depending, let's not get into that, in other fields of the capitalist system, does not work when you talk about land. And this is why the city needs to be regulated in a different and in a more complex way. And this is also, and this is where I get to the first question from the audience, why the political dimension in planning is always there. It is impossible to plan and not be political, because the moment you draw a line, you make a decision if something can be built or not, if somebody gets disenfranchised or somebody gets the opportunity to be there or not. So it is inherent, no matter what we do or what you want, it just is.
Thank you. And Aristide, if you want
to react, or otherwise I would.
Yeah, sorry, but I was kicked out. I didn't hear the question. I was kicked out, and for some minutes.
We have two questions. The first from Elvira from our PhD school, and is what about the political dimension of the city project? What if the interdisciplinary dimension of the project be the base for general discussion in the shared ground of political decision? And another question from Federica Vingelli from Naples. Good morning, and thank you for the interesting lectures. The issue of the spatial limits of the circular city system refer to the concept that Professor Russo expressed yesterday of indigenous regeneration, where the material values of circular projects derive from local processes and wasted landscapes. She would like to ask the speakers how this affects the question of the shape of the recycled city. Could we define it as a neo-vernacular project where the shape of the city depends on local waste materials more than modern city, as it was in the ancient city, where the relationship within the underground and the shape of the topside city above was fundamental? And she kindly asked if she can have an answer from Professor Paola Vigano for this question, but this is the resume.
Oh, but okay, if I can, I think that yes, there was also the question about the soil that maybe was important, maybe also for Gunther. About the political dimension, Elvira, I have to say that it's obvious. But I want to, so okay, I can say that there is a political dimension, of course. When you speak of world vision, I think that's quite evident. But I would stress more the presence of an ethical dimension. For example, in working, the third part of my intervention that I was too long and I couldn't develop was about the territory subjects. No, so this important shift that we are living with. I mean, not everybody, but for many of us, I think it's very important to consider the territory in all its different dimensions. So the different subjects and the subjects in itself. And this shift is very important and is typically, I think, an ethical, of course, political, but not only, it's also an ethical shift in the sense that you work for the emergence of this subject. It's not that the subject at a certain moment is jumping into the scene. It's that you are constructing the subject. So there is a process, the process, in fact, related to subjectivization. So you make of the territory, you make of soil, of water, of vegetation, of species, subjects. And with this, not only you give them rights, but also you reflect on the conditions that are normally their conditions to be subjected, no? to be always violated, no? to be weak. And for this, I think that the design of the future, the project of the future, has to be a project dealing with weakness. The weakness, our weakness, first of all, not only as a species, but our weakness as designers, our weakness as planners and urbanists. We are very weak in any case. So considering the place we have being quite weak, and working with the weak part of the territory. I'm very interested in a design and projects that work with the weak elements of the territory through this process of making them subjects. And this for me is not only political, but is also an ethical point. And of course, soil is part of this weak elements. About the question from Naples, in neo-vernacular, I don't know, maybe if I go back to the example, to the recherche of Marcel Proust, I think that, I don't know if you would like to name, for example, this work of reusing existing materials as neo-vernacular literature. I'm not sure. I think it's just a great literature. So the fact of changing the way of producing the city, of building the city, and of making of waste and reuse and recycle. About reuse, we have to be also very, very attentive, because the best recycle is, of course, the reuse. And we know that for architecture to be recycled is fundamentally to be reused. But in general, when we look at this new life cycle, I think that there is a quite large possibility. I don't think there is only one type of city that will be the result. There is one type of city if you take ideologically certain statement, for example, like the one that is still prevalent everywhere, so that we have to work by filling all the existing open spaces inside the already urbanized areas. I'm deeply against this logic that nevertheless is supported by strong ideologies and strong, let's say, also motivations. with the idea that otherwise we are going to consume other land or other soil. I think this is not the point. We agree on the idea that we have this effort of reconceiving the city from the existing city. So in this idea of a second degree, but this doesn't mean automatically that you are filling all the existing green spaces or non-built spaces. And when we speak of soil as a living organism, you know that soil can be reconstructed, and then even a banal asphalt paved parking space potentially is soil, is living soil potentially. So we have to read this potential that is in the city. When we work with the demineralization, etc., we work on the potential of making of that surface that is today dead, something that is alive. So the city as a renewable resource is really obliging us to reconsider the value of every single material, whatever it is, wherever it is. And that's, I think, the interesting of this, of continuing, let's say, to reflect on that.
Thank you. There's Aristides Athanasiadis that raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to, so I wanted to rebound on the comment from Paola on are there solutions or not? I think there are solutions. What we're missing is good ways to have criteria that tell us explicit criteria to say this is what I'm measuring and this is a success, this is a failure, and agree on these. These can be contextual or these can be local, but at least we're missing the rules of the game so far. If these are clear, then solutions are clear. It's a yes or a no, or there is an optimum solution. However, today we're just lacking I'm ready to sacrifice this for that. Today is we're mixing everything together and we're pretending that a solution will fix it, but it's not how it works. It's a negotiation, and in negotiation, you win some things and you lose some other things. And that's how we have to think it. So if we're talking about soil, well, reusing soil locally for making, bricks and reuse them as construction materials, that's great. That's a very nice initiative, but it's very cute compared to I will reduce my imports of concrete or copper and all of that, which have destroyed a huge amount of soil elsewhere. So this is the negotiation that you should be looking for. And as you said, being fluent in scales, or the fluidity of scales, is are you ready to plan for Venice? And actually, by planning for Venice, you're sacrificing some things internally for another city elsewhere in the world, because you know that this will profit you environmentally on the long run. So are you capable of saying, I'm going to plant trees somewhere else that will benefit me on the long run? These are the types of, negotiations, cross-scale negotiations that we also need to put forward.
Yes, Aristide, sorry, but you are, nevertheless, you are putting yourself in a position that is difficult to maintain. Or you imagine a planetary order, or you imagine to have a view that is so distant that you can, at the same time, completely have the overview of all the possible interacting consequences, which you will not have. That's why I'm talking of there is no solution. Of course, we are working for solutions, but the problem is that you don't have that position. Doesn't exist. And this is, I'm sorry, this is an old position in which you imagine that science can see everything, but that's not true. And science is limited as we are limited. And I think we have to live with that limitation.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing here very much. Thanks. Because the more you look into systems theory, the answer usually is, oh, it's really complicated. So we agree with you that we should keep trying to understand the complexity and not only look at a very specific segment and forget what happens abroad, forget the overall energy consumption from the beginning to end, and not just in the moment of construction, for example. But we can also never perfectionize the system, because again, it will become an absolute system that will still not work. I would like to add on your emphasis on indicators. Again, I also think we actually do have more indicators as you
rather than solutions.
We have them. We have again the targets. At every large development project, there's a monitoring and evaluation component. And there the issue again is, I think, the implementation and actually looking at them. Because again, it is they are very simple to gloss over that part, to not measure properly, or the question becomes political again, because other choices are being made, or certain solutions that we know would be right are maybe not really feasible. Should people even live in Venice? Sorry, it's provocative. Should even people live in the Ruhrgebiet in Western Germany, where if the pumps wouldn't be pumping perpetually, the entire area where 8 million people live would be flooded. In German, they call it the Ewigkeitskosten, the eternal cost that this incurs, because the pumps will have to keep pumping. It doesn't make sense, yet we have to live with it. And there we are back to what both of you were saying, that we need to balance. We need to find the trade-offs. And this is hard, and this is a process. It's not a solution, it's a path.
Thank you. We'll ask to Professor Vogt if you want to intervene and answer generically to the question and the discussion that comes from that.
It was for me a bit too much black and white, so you can calculate everything, and that's very difficult. We can only say whatever you do. I think somebody mentioned you draw a line and you change the world. Whatever you do with this line, it has consequences. That's the most important thing, and you cannot calculate it. Just we were discussing before about capitalism and liberal market. I just read a wonderful, interesting, and real good book about biodiversity by one of the most capitalist company I know and I'm working with. It's a Swiss reinsurance company offering insurance for natural catastrophe. And they are super capitalistic, but they understand how important biodiversity will be in the future. And I think that we cannot say it's good or bad. It has consequences, what we are doing. And I can give you another example. We have beside our semester a course, how do you feed a city? And then we invited Caroline Steele, who wrote a wonderful book about Hungry City is the name. And she compared the structure of Paris, the urban structure of Paris, with London. So completely different structure, not only different cuisine, as you know, but completely different structure. And then nobody in the end, as all Swiss students are never asking a question. So I asked the question, listen, Caroline, students are so interested to deal with urban farming, urban gardening. What is the right scale? And then she said, it's very easy, Günther. It's a middle scale. But now you have a new problem. What is the middle scale in Singapore, London, or Zurich? So you have to find out what is really the middle scale. You cannot use these common expressions and to adapt it to every city. You have to find it out. That's your work, to find out what is the scale in Zurich compared to Paris or whatever. what is the right scale? And I mean, if you're talking about this topic on the edge of Mexico City, it's not feeding the people, it's a social project. How can you measure the impact, what you're proposing? And especially if it's becoming to a social impact, it's not, you cannot measure it, you know, in terms of what is the income of these farmers and so on. It's more a social project than an agricultural project. It's not so easy to be so black and white. You know, it's very difficult to. The only thing I can say, whatever you do as architects, it has consequences, good or bad, or here or there. So that, and it's not so easy to calculate it and to say what are the consequences. Some are under your control, but not all of the consequences.
Thank you, Professor Gutmann. Does any other question or suggestion, solicitation?
I would like to add, if Dries, okay, we have only 1 minute left. Okay, cool. So basically, I think the crucial point here, just rephrasing, using some words from the lecture from Professor Pallavigano and Professor Gunther Vogt, is still in which way we might find these new alliances in order to get the proper process, as also Thomas said before. And so I think one of the crucial point, in fact, is understanding the shift in evaluation parameters, as we also discussed yesterday. In which way and which are the proper working units right now and nowadays? Because actually we have this kind of lack of not only our identity. I mean, recently I was reading a book from Just Mind It Again, as I said yesterday, but in a different way, where there are 3 different factors: identity, conception, and the last one is and communication. Okay, all these 3 kind of characterization of the same, more or less, territory. In which way they might be read altogether. So which kind of is this new metric, this new evaluation parameter again?
My idea is that there will be not only one metric, there will be several metrics. Each world view inspire different metrics. That's why for me a metric is not in itself is not absolute, and I want to understand from which perspective this metric is coming from.
It is, maybe I'm repeating a bit a part of the previous conversation we had. It is good that there's a different set of metric. It is good there's not one view to see the world and classify and measure it according to these indicators only and decide whether it's good or bad. We do live in a complex system, in a complex world. And of course, we live in this ambiguity as planners and as architects that on the one hand, we have to simplify. Every time we draw a map, we do an analysis, we take out certain aspects and delete everything else and ignore it. Otherwise, we would have just a copy of the reality. So on the one hand, we need to simplify, but it is an absolute positive thing that there's these competing indicators, competing worldviews, and we just have to keep working on that. And that's it. We should not try to explain the world in one perfect model. And this is fine.
I think this was the first one. Identity is a very difficult expression. I mean, I'm constantly telling my friends, not being architects or landscape architects, when we walk together in a landscape, I see completely different things than you see, because I know all the plants and the stones, and I see, like yesterday, a lot of snow. I saw all the traps of the animals and so. But you see something more touristic. Even you're at home here, and identity is a very difficult expression. You know? It's because everybody has the feeling, my city, let's say somebody in Venice, the identity of Venice for us, with mass tourism, cruise ship, and all these not so nice things besides the nice things. And identity is a very difficult expression, believe me. And I can give you a short. So somebody asked in the beginning about what are the consequences of the pandemic. I can tell you about Switzerland. The consequence is that we have a lot of pressure on the landscape. I had on last Monday a discussion with the agricultural department in Zurich, and they told me the first 10 meters of the field we cannot use to feed the animals because there is a lot of rubbish, and people from the city are using our fields as car parking. There is a lot of pressure because people want to leave the city, and there is not enough, even in Zurich, not enough space. And when I declared, but why are all the forests surrounding Zurich, and I'm talking about from my apartment, so 360 degrees, I have a forest in half an hour public transport. And so I said, but these are urban parks. No, absolutely no. This is identity. And you know why it's a no? Because it's not wheelchair accessible everywhere. And this cannot be possible. If you have a footpath every 10 meters for somebody from Germany, this is not a forest. I mean, this is a park. Ne? But this is identity. They read it completely different than I read it. For me, it's obviously a park. And during this pandemic, I was there. There are hundreds of people were in there, like in a park. Why is it not a park? And why does it follow the rules of the forestry economy? Why doesn't it follow an urban rule? And this is identity, and it's everybody sees it completely different. That's therefore I think it's a very difficult to work with. You
know? Thank you. One phrase to add, because we get back a bit to Paola Vigano's early statement about the periphery and the boundaries, because I think, and this wraps maybe the topic here up quite nicely, we have talked so much about the connectedness of systems, that everything is linked, no? What Aristide also has emphasized. But now we see that not everything should be the same. There should not be maybe a path every 10 meters, not everywhere the same landscape and urban system intertwined, but that we might need boundaries. And we should also look at where boundaries are actually useful and good to, we talk about density, of course, where maybe again the cities are a solution to protect other systems that we need and want to protect.
But that is where you go back to the beginning of the story. I mean, from the students' perspective, that one of the questions that they put on the table, if in fact you have to say reframe totally the city in this reframing, how you redistribute different meanings, not to the city. When I say city, you say in general, where we live in, so that's not only, and if the process of urbanization, or if this process of making a city is only to be considered a waste, or if you can also consider this a lever. So here there are two very, very different and antithetic positions. One is to say no, the city and making the production of the city automatically is related to wasting something else. So that there is a waste in any case, a net waste. And on the other side, there are people, I think some of the people that are here, and I include also myself in this, who thinks that it is possible to imagine the production of space as not only being related to the wasting of resources, but also in constructing resource and regenerating resources. These are very different positions. In Switzerland, to come back to the identity point that Gunther opened before, for example, if you make a national park, you have to close a part of the park. So at the center of the park, there will be an area where you, as a human, you cannot enter. And this is meant for, say, wilderness, which means that in a territory that is inhabited, so in everywhere, as to Switzerland, but you can take Europe, you can take a big part of the planet. This means that we are antithetic. So we are not coherent with that vision. So that we should retreat. And especially when you go to, even on the mountains, no, here in Italy or in the Apennine or also on the Alps, you have places inhabited everywhere on the Alps. Yes, not maybe beyond 2,000 meters, but yes, below, yes. And the park, the regional parks, for example, as also economic drivers, are very important. You can support territories that are difficult to access, to maintain people to live there. But I think that the answer, okay, you will become a park and then you have to disappear. That's really a message very, very strong and very hard to imagine. But there are really two different parties, and in one case you would say yes, you have to retreat. That's why I think it's quite urgent for me to, and for many people to work on the idea of this coexistence. Can we or not coexist with other processes, ecological processes? Are we really antithetic? And why should we be antithetic? I mean, we are part of nature as the rest, so why should we be so antithetic? So I think that's a very big question, but my perspective is that we can work, and the design of space can participate to this specific, say, positioning on the idea of coexistence, where in fact the point is this: are we simply antithetic or not?
But excuse me, so do you think, Professor Pallavigano, that the urban project might be the link between this kind of lack in this coexistency? So might be the rule, exactly, maybe the centrality.
I think that design is for sure is an important tool to discuss this topic, because this is not an abstract topic, I mean, it's very concrete. So you should say clearly how you can live together, How can you really share the same space? If you are not abandoning, if you are remaining there, you are occupying part of space. And how you can prove that you are not antithetic, that you can, in fact, when we say a park, for example, we don't need to disconnect completely, I mean, put a fence or symbolical or physical, a fence around it and say, okay, this is not for us. So here is interesting because, of course, but this is another seminar to be dedicated to this point.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I think that we ended our time, or I'm asking my colleagues if we have spare time, but I think that we
actually we already ran out of time, but I think it was worth it.
Yeah, of course. So we probably we have a lot of questions, but we're being polite and respecting the timing of your time and of the conference, and we are going to switch to the lunch break. Or Margherita, do you raise them? No? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to show you the program for this afternoon briefly. So this is what we're having later. So we would like to remind that the last section, the next question, will be on space, and will take at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and the professor Miodrag Mitrasinovic from Parsons School.
Ce l'hai da condividere?
Is not sharing. Sorry.
Yeah, we do not see the program, Giacomo. If you want,
Yes, to share it, but I don't know why, because I'm sharing. Okay, thank you. Let me know when the slide is on.
We see your Microsoft Teams application
and not even right now, right?
No.
Oh, man. I'm sorry.
I will share the program, okay?
Sorry for that. I will click to the sharing.
That works.
Yes.
Okay, so we will have Miodrag Mitrasinovic from Parsons New School, Arjen van Timmeren from TU Delft, and David Washmuth from McGill University of Toronto. And as a discussant, Mathieu Berger from UCL Bruxelles, Nicolas Katsikis from TU Delft again, and Julie Marin from KU Leuven. And it will be, I'd like to thank all of our guests for their generous contribution to this session.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much to all of you. It was a really fascinating morning.
Grazie a tutti.
Grazie a tutti. Ciao.
Arrivederci.